Hey, um, hello everyone. Welcome to the next installment of the GSA Early Career Leadership Program Leadership Dialogue series. Just a brief introduction to the webinar interview series. We are members of the Community and Membership Engagement Subcommittee, and we focus on addressing the challenges and concerns of our fellow early career scientists by facilitating team building activities and also creating networking opportunities for the members in the cohort. And we're excited to organize the Leadership Dialogue series to highlight the roles of effective leadership in research. We're inviting recognized science leaders from both academia and industry to share their thoughts on what being a leader means to them and the qualities needed to be an effective leader in science. And these discussion sessions will be available on YouTube, so early career scientists in the Genetic Societies of America and beyond can access and benefit from them. And through this series, we aim to promote conversations about the importance of good leadership in academic research and how it can significantly impact laboratory cultures and the global scientific communities. Now, before we dive into the exciting discussions, let's just go around and introduce ourselves a little bit. I can start off and then folks can chime in. My name is Lee Shuhe. I'm a graduate student at the University of Arizona.
Yeah, good afternoon. My name is Bello Samuel. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada.
Hello, everyone. My name is Irina Yushenova, and I'm a research scientist at Marine Biological Laboratory in Woods Hole, Massachusetts.
And my name is Rebecca, and I'm a PhD student at the Institute of Science and Technology in Austria. And now we can move on to welcome our speaker. So we are super excited today to welcome Dr. Teresa Lee to our Leadership Dialogue series. Dr. Teresa Lee is an assistant professor at the University of Massachusetts Lowell since fall of 2020. Her lab uses the C. elegans model organism to discover the epigenetics of complex traits, looking at how chromatin landscapes are passed from one generation to the next. Dr. Lee has spent time all over the US, completing her undergraduate degree in biology at UNC Chapel Hill, then undertaking a big move from coast to coast to complete her PhD at Berkeley, studying meiotic crossover recombination in C. elegans, and then moved cross country once again, this time to Georgia, where she completed her postdoc in the epigenetics of longevity at Emory University. Beyond her research, Dr. Lee is dedicated to inclusive teaching and mentoring and has had a large impact on the next generation of scientists. As a recipient of the NIH ERACTA grant, she has developed and taught classes at Clark Atlanta University, the Emory Tibet Science Initiative, and Oglethorpe University during her postdoc. As a professor, she has also recently received both the UMass Lowell Biological Sciences Teaching Excellence Award and the Faculty Excellence Award for mentoring Riverhawk Scholar Academy students. We are so lucky to have the opportunity today to speak with Dr. Lee and welcome. And we're super excited to ask you our questions.
Thank you, Dr. Lee, for joining us. I will go first with my first question. Having studied and worked across the US in a rapidly evolving field, how have you been able to diversify your experience to shape your scientific approach and leadership style?
I think, it's common wisdom, especially in biology, that you should try to move between undergrad to grad school to postdoc, even different postdocs. And that can certainly be difficult for many trainees, depending on their life stage and other constraints. But one of the advantages is that you really get to see how different institutions and how the people at those institutions just have a huge variety of approaches to even the smallest decisions, like how fellowships get assigned, how recruiting happens, and behavior that could be acceptable and normal in one place could just be beyond the pale in another location, depending on the culture. So, one of the advantages of just being exposed to different kinds of institutions is you realize how hard it is to actually lead a team of people, and then how common it is in the sciences for people to just it be like the blind leading the blind. So in some ways that's sad, but in other ways it's reassuring because you realize no one really has it entirely figured out. I actually hadn't realized how much I had moved until y'all were saying it during my introduction. Um, and even though I've worked at different geographically distinct institutions. Like my undergrad was at a large public flagship university. My PhD was at the same kind of institution. Um, I went to a private medical school for my postdoc and already was so surprised by the things that were different. And at the time, it wasn't clear to me if it was just different because it was a different place, or if there's something different about the way a medical school approaches it, or maybe it's this kind of med school versus a different kind of med school. And so, because I had spent so much time during my PhD thinking about organizations and about leadership, I started asking other trainees that I met how things were done at their institutions. And honestly, not just trainees. If I talked to other PIs, I was like, well, how do you handle graduate recruiting? Who makes these decisions? Um, and so, again, I know it's not always possible for everyone to be able to pick up and move to a completely different location. But one of the advantages of at least trying to see the distinctions or different leadership cultures is that you just have more tools in your toolkit of approaches to try. And you're like, oh, I always assumed everyone does it this way. But if you know that one other school tries it a different way, you realize that the things you assumed everybody does might only be true, for instance, in the States. So even getting to meet people internationally and realizing other countries have very different approaches. Um, and I think one of the themes for training is that nobody can actually tell you what will work for you. It's that you and maybe your mentor have to try out many different things, and one of those will hopefully work. So the more opportunities and ideas that you have, the more likely you are to find a thing that will work for you and that you even realize can be changed. So I'm really glad to have been able to see lots of different approaches to leading and managing across the institutions I've worked at.
So after having such a wild experience, what leadership qualities do you value the
Mhm.
most, and how have you cultivated them over the course of your own career?
Mhm. It is interesting to I'm not sure that I have. So I wonder if my answer to the first part of your question might be different than what I've been able to cultivate. We'll see. Um, what leadership qualities do I value the most? I don't know how, if I could phrase it in one word, but I think to realize that if you're leading a team, you're responsible for that team. So that means that each individual component of the team, you're responsible for their development and growth, but you're also responsible for the entire team itself. So you can't always give everything just to one person, even if they might need that support, if that sacrifices the development of other people on the team. And I think that's what makes leading really hard. Like if you're working with one other person, you can give them their all. If you're a PI leading a lab of 10 people, you can't always give one grad student all of your attention if you also have to pay attention to other things. So I think that in terms of the really successful leaders I've seen are able to find a really good balance of realizing who needs their help at a specific time, but not losing that mentality that the whole team needs to be served in that way. And then also, maybe a sort of secondary component of that is realizing that as a leader, you don't have to do everything all on your own. So it's in creating an environment where each member of the team, even the most junior member, can still contribute and help other people. And so that sort of gets to an exponential way of making it so that you, as in this case in academia, you as the PI, I don't have to train every single person all the time if I can rely on other people to help me with that training, or to even notice like, oh, I noticed so and so is really down because of these like political events in the world. Maybe we can do something. And again, creating that environment, that's been one of the most delightful things out of being a PI, is when I see the people in my lab being caring and compassionate and thoughtful in ways that would not have even occurred to me, or I might have never had the chance to notice just because I'm not around. So I think I don't know what quality that would be, but that's what I've seen in terms of success. Um, I think for me, what I've tried to cultivate, even though I still feel relatively junior in the field, um, is uh, to put myself in as many situations as possible where I'm forced to work with different kinds of people. So I often see that um, you assume, or we all do, I think it's human nature, to assume the way we like to do things and the way our brains work is the way it works for everyone. Um, and I learned in graduate school that how damaging that can be to not realize like some small adjustments on the part of the person who has more power can really change things and help someone who's still learning their way. So now that I am in a position of power leading my own lab, I am pretty confident that I can work with many different kinds of personality types just because I'm aware that just because someone is really forgetful in this one way doesn't mean that they hate science or they dislike the lab or they don't care. It just means they're like just bad at remembering things. So I can work with them to come up with a strategy. For me, it's leaving post-it notes on my phone because I will always grab my phone and then I'll see the post-it note. So like really tiny things like that, but just as someone in charge is just if I encounter someone whose brain is different than mine, and that's going to be like pretty much everyone else in the world, it's to never assume that it means anything, but to try to figure out what the roadblock might be and to help that person. And I think during my PhD and my postdoc, I had fallen into these opportunities to work with a wide variety of people. And so by the time I knew I had to run my lab, I was relatively confident that I could recruit a lot of people. And I had a sense of who I can work effectively with and who I just really can't motivate. And so I'm pretty careful about helping those people find a better fit for them than my own lab. And part of that is just like right now, I'm a tenure track professor. I have a small lab. I can't be there all the time. So if someone needs less independence, more guidance, I just know that I can't always give it to them right now. And it doesn't mean that they're not going to be a great researcher. It's just that my environment or the way I communicate or what I like to have happen in my lab isn't going to be a good fit. So I think it's just seeing the diversity of approaches and ways of dealing with the world means I don't have to assume anything negative about somebody if they're different from me. I can try to figure out if there actually is an issue. And if definitely sometimes like if there are problems and there are issues, but it's helped me be really maybe compassionate in my approach to working with my trainees in that way.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, you touched on it a little bit, but alongside leadership, mentorship has also been a very key theme of your career. And I know for me, when I started the PhD, we had people coming in with a bachelor's background, a master's background. I'm in Europe, so everyone came from a lot of different European countries, but also all over the world, like how I came from the US. But this kind of leads into our next question. How do you approach mentoring students from a wide range of backgrounds to make sure that all of them are able to thrive in research and academia or the path of their choosing?
Yeah. Um, I think one of the things during my PhD that really frustrated me, but then also inspired me, was to realize that the training we get as researchers really prepares us well for all different kinds of careers. So then realizing that I can recruit people into my lab and it's 100% okay if they don't end up wanting to be a PI. And honestly, it's okay if they don't necessarily want to stay at the bench or stay in research. Because I know I can teach them the ways in which troubleshooting, honestly, file organization, data management, working with others, mentoring others, just the logistics of organizing something like this, which is the skills that y'all are getting. I know that's going to be valued in any job that wants to hire someone with a bachelor's or someone with a master's, and certainly someone with a PhD. Um, And so I think one of the advantages I have as a mentor, again, is being really intentional about realizing what we call those soft skills are actually maybe some of the most important skills that you acquire in a PhD, because on it, like next gen sequencing has already changed since I did my PhD to where we are now. So yeah, that was a skill I acquired, but is it actually going to be helpful? Versus people are people. So if you learn to work with a team of people, that is going to serve me hopefully throughout my entire career. Um, and so I think one of the things I try to help my own trainees realize is the distinction between people who are mentors in their life and people who are supervisors or advisors. And what's hard for them, and what was hard for me initially, is that as the I am always the supervisor and the advisor. I am often the mentor, but I cannot always be the mentor. And there are going to be sadly times in academia where the best interest of the team, like me keeping my lab afloat, might not be in the best interest of a particular individual. Um, and it's helping them realize I am doing this not because I don't care about them, but because I have these other priorities that I'm and responsibilities. But then that is part of why I should not be their only mentor. I think I've done a bad job if I'm the only person they have to turn to. So it's just realizing that one of the activities I have our PhD students in our program do is draw a Venn diagram, I think, of their advisor or their PI, their boss, and their mentor, and then just to ask what are the traits that are in common between those roles, and then what are the traits that are unique to each of those roles, and then just helping them walk through sort of not the best case scenarios. It's often when things go wrong and you realize there are some times where your PI cannot be a mentor to you because they cannot separate what's best for them or their lab from what's best for you. And that, again, that's human nature too. So it's not beating myself up too much if I find myself in that situation, and then helping my mentees find the team that they need so they know if I tell them something, they can turn to someone else and hear a different perspective. Of course, my hope is that it will be the other person will tell them the same thing I'm telling them, but I want them to have that security to know that it's not just me that thinks that, right? And if I am wrong, then hopefully they will be able to hear other perspectives from other people, and then bring that back to me too. So mentoring is just no one can be everything to all people. And there are times, unfortunately, in any really career setting where your boss and your supervisor is sometimes the worst possible person to mentor you because of the constraints of what's needed at the time. And I aspire to be a mentor for everyone in my lab, but I just know that if it really came down to like getting this paper out or me being the most possible compassionate person, I don't know if I'm always going to make the right choice at the right time under stress. So I'd rather that they have the support, the tools they need, even if at the time I'm not able to give it to them.
This is actually really interesting because I've never heard such nuances from someone with a faculty perspective. So this is actually really, really interesting. And it seems like you obviously have a lot of working knowledge of being intentional with the people under your leadership and giving them what they could need without completely reshuffling your priorities or your responsibilities currently on your shoulder. And you, during our research, we also found you've been recognized for excellence in teaching and mentoring at UMass Lowell as a faculty member. But I just want to rewind a little bit. How did you develop your
Mhm.
leading, teaching, mentoring philosophy while you're earlier in your career, say like a postdoc, senior graduate student?
Yeah. Um, from my own struggle. And I know this happens to all PhD students, but I call them the dark times. Um, and so I had, unfortunately, what felt like 3 of the 4 solid years of darkness, where I think I wasn't able to hear the things I hear. I wasn't able to take away the constructive parts of what I was being told. Um, and so part of that was, again, not building myself a mentoring team where I could hear the same thing, but from multiple different people, right? Um, and it's unfortunate, but like if you are screwing up, someone has to tell you you're screwing up. And that is a hard thing to hear. And you need to establish a lot of trust in order to hear that. And the worse you're messing up, the harder that is to hear. And I think I was only hearing the bad things and not hearing what it was that I needed to change. Um, and so during my PhD, I had taken classes at the business school, one of which included organizational behavior, which is what they call management now. And that's where the word or the concept of managing up is the first time I'd ever heard it. It completely changed my mentality, is that I had agency to change what was being done. So rather than feel like everything is bad, there's nothing I can do, like I'm only hearing terrible, mean things, it was, well, if what I'm doing isn't good enough, I have to believe at some point that is true. And in my case, like nothing was working. So it was very evident. Um, and then it's realizing like if I just kept doing what I was doing, nothing was going to change. So I was the only person who could do something different. Like I don't control anybody else in the world. I wish I could wave my wand and end up in a good fit of a mentoring environment, or like, get a postdoc who could supervise every single thing I did. But the only thing I could change was my own behavior. So then it was in trying to solicit concrete and actionable task. Like if what I'm doing is bad, I am not trying to be bad. So what can I try to do in order to be good? And that mentality helped me realize how little we talk about this, like giving of feedback and receiving of feedback and cultivating that as a skill. And so once again, I realized there's this entire field of study of how to work with people, that we know a lot about human nature, humans working in teams. Um, I started paying more attention to the dynamics of any really group that I participated in. And then you begin to see the ways that it doesn't feel hard to step up as a leader if you realize that that is actually a vacuum or a role that you can assume. And this is what I tell my trainees, like you can always manage your peers. You can always manage up no matter what level you're at. And in hindsight, I think back to my friends in college and grad school, there were people who were much better and savvier and better prepared about doing that for themselves. And I just wasn't. I think I wasn't entirely ready and just wasn't aware of that as something I could be active about doing. So I now that I am in charge and get to lecture everyone in my lab all the time about anything I want, it's in helping them realize that they also have that agency. So something I can do, and I believe it's my responsibility to do, since I'm the person in the relationship with the most power as the PI, I do have a responsibility towards their development. I create a lot of structure. So I ensure that they are receiving feedback from me. And I try to ensure they're hearing both positive and negative feedback. I make sure my negative feedback, again, is constructive. So like, I'm like, it's not just, oh, this was bad. It's bad because you're using a typeface that's too small and no one can read it. So here's how you would change it. And it's actually in challenging myself. I mean, you might not realize this, but like I think bosses get annoyed all the time. Like I think I just get frustrated or angry, but if I'm feeling that way, I'm like, well, what can I tell this person that they can actually that's actionable, right? Like is it that I just don't like your face and you can't change that? And then I'm like, okay, that's just something I have to control in myself. But often I'm like, okay, why am I feeling annoyed? I'm like, oh, it's because they didn't spend enough time preparing for this. I can tell that they rushed it. And so the thing that they have to do now is build in that time. So it's in challenging myself anytime I feel frustrated is in trying to ensure that what I'm saying is actually something that the person can change. Um, and that just has meant that I'm always taking a moment, and that when I'm providing that kind of feedback, it's almost never in anger, right? I'm always like giving myself a beat, not because I'm trying to, but it's like if you're trying to think rationally of like, why is this so annoying to me? Why am I so angry? Then I can turn that into something that they're able to change. And I do think that is one of the hardest things to do as a mentor is to always to like maybe anyone who's a parent or has a pet also has felt this way is that you're trying to help someone improve, but if it's given in an emotional way, it's really hard for someone to receive that feedback and then use it to benefit themselves. So I've told my lab that I can't guarantee I will never yell at them, but I try to promise that it will only yell once and then I will stop and remove myself and try to turn that into something actionable. Yeah. And I've just seen, because I spend quite a bit of time on a Slack for new PIs, for people who have less experience and have maybe just thought less about their own responsibilities as a PI. It's just like you hear people just snap or get frustrated or lash out. And I do think the person who has more power in a relationship, it is more their responsibility to try to realize that's happening and then build an environment where that is not the first reaction. Right. So if you just know that you have a short fuse, then you would just never respond that way. You will always write everything out and bring it to an individual meeting. Right. And so the hope is every adult behaves in this way. I think we've all met enough people in the world that to know how rare this is. So I would like for this to be discussed more when we're talking about how to lead and manage a lab, is this concept that it is the responsibility of the more senior person in a relationship. And so for my trainees, even if they're undergrads mentoring another undergrad, I'm like, it is on you to try to see the ways that you get frustrated, what really pisses you off, what doesn't, and then to see if you're able to manage it. And you won't always be able to, but just even that the metacognition of asking what is frustrating, what works, and then what are the kinds of people I can work with. It's just helping my mentees see that also means they're better mentees for me as well. And then I think we all have a lot of compassion for each other that we are trying, even if we're not always succeeding.
Yeah, thank you. I believe you are a good mentor. Just a fellow question. Having won Iraqda Award grant, where you contributed to inclusive teaching initiative, please could you dwell more about this experience and what you learned from teaching and mentoring in such a unique environment?
Yeah, I love that this opportunity exists. So it's an NIH postdoctoral fellowship. I will spell it out, IRACDA. So if there are any senior grad students thinking about their next steps, you can Google NIH Iraqda, and then you'll see the wide variety of universities that have this funded program. What I really love about it is twofold. One is that it provides formal training for how to teach effectively. So again, pedagogy is an entire discipline where like researchers are conducting studies to see how people learn effectively. For many people, if you want to stay in academia, teaching, whether it's formal or informal, is going to be part of your job, even though that's not always acknowledged in many parts of training. So it was having that be acknowledged as a skill, and then me being given the resources to get better at it, and then the opportunities to actually practice it with real students, I think really set me up for success when I eventually became a faculty member. The other thing I really loved about this program is that at many places, it recruits a cohort of postdocs. So many of y'all might be familiar with how isolating it can be to leave your PhD environment and then start as a postdoc because you're just like you're alone, you're in a lab. Maybe you make friends with the other people in your lab, but depending on your institution, there might be no other opportunities to meet or hang out with or get to know other postdocs. And I had just said how important it was to build yourself a mentoring team and make connections, and start looking for leadership opportunities. So it's just like really hard. That is changing. Even in the last 10 years, I've been really impressed with how much people are acknowledging how important that support for postdocs is. But it's not everywhere. Um, and not all PIs, I think, are aware of encouraging their postdocs to seek out those opportunities. So the benefit of coming in as a cohort is just like I didn't have to try to meet other postdocs working in very different disciplines. So I did my Erecta Fellowship at Emory University. So we had someone from public health, we had someone from psychology, we had someone who was a joint anthropology and like human epidemiology person. Um, and I think it really challenged me in a fun way scientifically to just sit through their talks and provide feedback. There's some fun collaborations that happened. And then it meant that I knew I could communicate about my own work to a really broad audience. And then if I couldn't, they were definitely helped me get better at presenting that. So I was really well prepped for my job talk. Um, and then it's just we were able to have socials if I ever needed help with like some, I'm trained as a geneticist and not trained in genomics. So when I got to some gnarly stats, it was just like way over my head. But of course, the epidemiologist was like really well prepared. So I could go ask some really dumb questions to someone that I was like, I'm trying to Google this and I just can't figure it out from Wikipedia. Could you walk me through this? So the benefit of a cohort was really helpful. And I emphasize that to sort of encourage people, if you start your postdoc and you don't have that opportunity, is to try to seek it out or build it for yourself, even if the institution doesn't provide it. Because I think most of the strides we've seen in support for postdocs, sadly, has been postdoc initiated, where they got the universities to give a little bit of support, but it's always postdocs advocating for themselves, organizing and doing all of that work. So my hope is that is beginning to exist at many institutions. And then if it doesn't at yours, is to ask why and then to see what it is that you're able to do. And I think the nice thing about my particular Erecta program at Emory is that they were very serious about preparing us for all aspects of being a faculty member. So certainly we needed excellent research. We had many opportunities to work on our grantsmanship and apply for other funding mechanisms. Um, but also it's again, all of the other stuff that you just don't know is part of what your job is going to be like as a PI. So certainly working with other people, certainly the teaching, but even just the bureaucracy and the logistics and all like getting yourself set up. Um, I didn't entirely know how much time that would take. But because I had this cohort and because I had seen postdocs just ahead of me start their positions, I at least had people I could ask for support. And I kind of knew, I could tell it was coming, even if I wasn't entirely prepared for it. Um, so it was just like a very well-rounded approach to postdoctoral training. Whereas I think for many people, they think it's all about the science, and that's certainly really important. But then it's once you start your lab, if you're not ready for all of the other stuff, it's going to be a hard first year, if not first few years. So just being able to play act a little bit about all of those different aspects of being a PI during my postdoc in a very safe environment where I was responsible for nothing. It was really helpful for me.
That's just amazing. Thanks a lot. Because indeed, sometimes it can be super lonely. If it's small school,
Mhm.
small organization, indeed can be very hard. And this program sounds amazing. We're definitely gonna put link into description to this
Mhm.
video. So, and I wanna a little bit switch toward, we keep talking about inclusive research, teaching, mentoring, all of this. So how do you see this inclusive teaching shape the future of science education and whole?
Mm.
And what role should the institutions as organization and leaders in this organization play in such transformation?
Yeah, this is I think, one of my biggest soapboxes. Um, so sometimes I talk to my colleagues who are a little crankier about the concept of being inclusive. They somehow see it as diluting the rigor or the excellence of the science that we're doing, which is a false dichotomy. And we know that that is not true. So I like to push back up against that for its own sake. But what I'm frustrated by is we never ask ourselves what the costs are of keeping things the status quo. So if someone has to start a lab and they've never had to work with a team, they have no idea who they're like as a mentor, they're probably not going to be very good at it, right? Why would anyone be good at anything if you've never practiced it? Um, and that is not free. That person has a lab that is funded, at least in the US, by probably federal grant money. Certainly, the institution has put some money into that, right? So if they take on trainees and those trainees end up leaving, not for good reasons, but because it was a bad environment, that is a waste. That is a waste of funding. That's a waste of a project. That's a waste of resources, right? And so I think my frustration is when I advocate for the concept that leading and managing is a skill and it can be taught and it can be practiced. It's not something that people are just naturally good at and then everyone else isn't, and then that's it, right? This is a thing that it may come easier or it may come harder, but everyone can work at it and get better. And we actually, I think many of us now believe that that's the case for bench work, right? Like maybe in the past people thought, oh, there's just people who have good hands and then other people that don't. But I think many people appreciate how it takes years to become an effective troubleshooter. No one necessarily expects someone to come in and be able to handle thousands of PCRs on the first day, right? It's a learning curve. It just takes time. And we certainly appreciate that for things like sports or music. And so I think my frustration is running a lab is really hard. We have so little preparation for it. And it's costly, not just in terms of money, although it is, but then who are the people that are leaving and who are the people that are going to be most affected by this, right? I think the data show and what I've seen is that people who already feel like they don't belong, are the ones that are most likely to leave. People who already look different or are different in some way from the majority of the environment are the ones who are going to not be supported if we're not really intentional about recruiting and supporting these people. And then, like, if you look at STEM and the demographics, you see that that's the case. So it's costly both in who it is that we select for, and what it is that we're selecting for. And then it's like literally costly. Like, do you know how expensive a graduate student is? Like, how much money is put in to the stipend and the reagents and the training? So if a student gets all of that training and then decides that becoming like staying in research isn't for them, they'd like to go into consulting, that's good. They're taking that training and they're still using it for what they want to do. But if a student goes through all of that and thinks, I don't have what it takes, I hate this, like I'm not good at this, everything is bad, I'm just going to leave, then they're not taking anything useful out of that training. And we just spent all of the money and resources, and that's gone nowhere. So I think my frustration is when I advocate for teaching people how to lead and run a team well, everyone's like, but what are we sacrificing? Like they really have to learn all of cell biology. We can't not teach them that. And then I'm like, but what are we losing if we don't? What is the cost? And right now, there's a lot of resistance to trying to measure efficacy of mentoring and to track outcomes. Um, I appreciate that there is a lot of stochasticity in graduate training. You may have seen some of the chatter online about, we can track GPAs, we can track GRE scores, we can even track research experience, and almost none of those factors predict success in graduate school because there's just so much luck. Um, and then my frustration is I wish we could acknowledge the parts of it that aren't luck if we really support the people who are leading and then give them the tools they need to lead effectively. And then maybe widen our definition of what success would look like. But it's just someone thinking they are bad only because of all of these communication issues or just a lack of understanding for mentoring. like no one can argue that that's a success, even if that person ends up finding something they like and being really happy there. There might be easier ways to get there.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I definitely agree with your thoughts, especially on inclusive teaching. And I think, at least coming from the US and then moving to Europe, there's definitely a difference in the teaching style. I think here, even a lot less inclusive teaching than it was back in my undergrad. But I'm hoping that this will also slowly trend and shift
Mhm.
here as well. So kind of moving into the next question, you talked already about as a PI and as a leader for your lab, you're balancing research, you're balancing teaching, you're still doing a lot of service. And do you have any kind of tips or tricks that you use to manage all of these responsibilities simultaneously while still being so excellent in everything?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I am achieving excellence. One of the pieces of advice I got from my postdoc advisor is that as a PI, you are just going to drop balls. You're juggling a lot of balls, and they are going to drop, and you have to know that that's coming. And he said the skill is which are the rubber balls and which are the glass balls. So it's just like knowing you can't always do it all. And then and actually acknowledging that, and maybe y'all are in this same position too, but it's like we are in research because we're high achieving. We don't like not giving our all to everything that we're doing. But he warned me about this, and I can now say that it is true. Like you have just too much coming at you when you're running a lab. You cannot be an A+ student at every single thing that you're doing. So you have to ask yourself, and you have to be mentally okay with being a C- student for some things, like when I'm taking a training on how to order stuff in my university system, I don't have to give it my all. That's okay. I need to focus my all on other things. But that can actually like be really hard to deal with mentally. It's I was told when I was teaching, and this is also true. It's like I love teaching. I care about my students. I would like to give it my all. And yet, in the position I'm in, I only have to be okay as a teacher, but I do have to be excellent as a researcher. So if I'm pouring all of myself into my classes, what is it that I'm letting drop and what actually will matter, at least for me right now? And also the reality is the students in my classes might not be able to tell the difference between an A+ me and like a B- me. Or if they tell, can they tell that much, right? Will it really matter to them? And so I think it's like uh, maybe the answer to your question is to know yourself and to be really honest with yourself. And then knowing that I'm the kind of person that it's a little embarrassing. I blame it for my PhD training because my advisor was a stickler for detail, which is in some ways has been very good, but in other ways means I will spend 30 minutes making sure everything in my PowerPoint is exactly aligned, and it's just like, oh, would it look a little bit better over here to the left, or do I want it balanced? Anyway, so it's just like for my teaching slides, that does not matter and nobody cares. Maybe for my job talk, it was worth it, right? When there's a lot riding on it. But if I'm lecturing Tuesday, Thursday, nobody cares. My yellows do not have to match, right? The students do not care. Um, but I will let myself just dive into that and then spend hours doing it. So knowing that about myself and then asking myself what's important, I have to set constraints on the time and stop myself from starting to prepare for teaching too early. Um, and so I think it's just being really brutally honest with yourself, realizing what your position might take, and knowing that at any given point in time that the priorities might change. So when I only had undergraduates in my lab, their training was important, but maybe a little bit less so now that I have a PhD student in my lab. I really need to spend much more time with them early on right now because I'll have them for so much longer and they'll set the tone for the rest of my trainees. Um, and I think it's realizing balance will change. You have to constantly reevaluate it. And then you might just need friends to like smack you around a little bit if you're not always able to be that brutally honest with yourself. Um, especially if you're like another thing I know about myself is I have a lot of opinions. I've wanted to make a lot of change. I like getting involved with things. And then the question is, for my position now, where research is the most important priority, how many committees can I actually handle being on? Do any of those committees matter? Does anyone actually care? So even though I might be offered an opportunity that I am the best person for, and I am really excited about it, I have to look at everything else that I'm doing and then be honest with myself about, even if it's only 2 hours every other week, that might end up being a significant chunk of time. And can I handle that right now with everything else I have going on? Um, and so, another piece of advice I got is to build yourself a committee of no. So before accepting anything new, to just talk to another human about it, and then they'll look you in the eyes and be like, "No, Teresa, you're already doing way too much. Like, as exciting as this is, you just got to say no, if you know that you're not always the kind of person who can turn down those kinds of opportunities."
Actually, that's a great idea, the committee of no. I might have to look into
Yes.
that, actually.
We one of the things we've joked about is getting like a punch card, where if you get 10 no's, then you get an ice cream or something to help incentivize it.
Awesome. Anyway, I want to switch gears a little bit because I know we've talked a lot about, you as a mentor and how you could best navigate the relationship and all the different details that comes with, trying to lead a lab of your own. And this will be a very general question. What do you think, like, how can institutions or I guess like leaders beyond the level of just faculty members in a department or a PI better support, early career researchers just like me, Irina, everyone else here to foster creativity, innovation, and just trying to, I guess, grow into leaders of our own, stuff of that nature?
Yeah, I think two things come to mind. Um, the first is to realize that in order to be creative, you have to take risk. And it's really hard to do that as a human if you don't feel safe. Um, and so, if you think about the way academia is structured, there's a lot of pressure and a lot of stress. And that is actually counter to creating an environment where you can like try something crazy and maybe big risk, big reward. But if you don't feel like, if you're like, I have to get 3 papers in order to graduate, I can't spend 2 months doing some crazy idea that might never work because I have to crank out this. We are incentivizing exactly the behavior that leads to very small incremental steps, which doesn't mean that science doesn't get done. But when I hear people bemoaning, so it's often a kids these days thing, right? Like I hear more senior colleagues saying, the grad students nowadays just don't like they're not creative, they don't care enough, they're not as passionate enough. I really wish the conversation could be, how are our structures incentivizing that kind of behavior? And I mean, the reality is, if you were a PhD student in the 70s, your life might have been hard for many reasons, but it was like pretty easy to get a job as a PI because that was a bubble in the US where we were expanding the number of colleges that existed and hiring like crazy, right? Um, I mean, if y'all look at the NIH, the age of the first grant graphed over time, it is now like 10 or 15 years higher currently than it was uh, 20 or 30 years ago, right? So in the past, you would get your first NIH grant, your first big one in your 30s. Now I think that, oh, I wish y'all should look it up and link to it, but I'm pretty sure it's something like 41 or 42. Um, right. And then, like, if you think of a human, especially if it's a woman, someone in your 30s, someone in your 40s, you're at very different parts of your life at that time. Um, and so it's just like, yeah, do we feel like we can be risk-taking and creative if these are the constraints, if we know that you have to submit 10 grants to get one funded? Um, and so it's not, I mean, like, that isn't going to change without some magical thinking of like, let's just fund the NIH more. And then I understand there's lots of constraints against that. But when I hear people complaining about it, I just wish they acknowledge that humans don't do things, right? It's not human nature never changes. It's not that we are genuinely less creative now. It's one, the problems are harder. Two, society is different. And then if we are feeling scared or like we have to play it safe, why? That doesn't come from nowhere. Um, and then the second thing, answer to your question, is to realize again that one, if you think going into your PhD is going to get you a job in academia, I would like it for us to acknowledge it's a bit of a pyramid scheme when you see the number of positions that currently exist. I'm most familiar with the States, but from talking to people in other countries, I suspect that this is true across the board. Um, the most recent data I've seen for biology PhDs is that 15% or less are in an academic position within 5 years of starting to look for one, a PI position, I should say, right? So that's 15%. That is 85% of PhDs who leave academia. Um, so again, this idea that the whole point of doing this training is to become a PI isn't wrong, but I wish we could be a little more expansive with, again, the definition of what this training and what success would look like. Um, so then we can really like support our students if we built in aspects of the training that we know will serve them no matter what it is that they go on to do. Then I don't have to feel like I'm lying to a first year grad student by convincing them to come into my lab and do this if I know that they have a 15% chance of becoming a PI and that's the only job that they want, right? So I think it's again realizing how important all of these other aspects of graduate training are going to be, regardless. Like, if you become a PI, you're going to need these skills, but they will also serve you if you don't. And there's so many parts of graduate training that help that. I think a lot of those are acquired almost accidentally, and I wish we were more intentional about building those in to programs.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, based on your profile, I realized that you opened your lab during the global pandemic, I mean the COVID pandemic in 2020. So as a good mentor, you also need mentorship to be able to be a good PR. So how were you able to manage, navigate, opening your lab during this pandemic period? And what are your thoughts on the mentorship that were available to you that time? Yeah.
Yeah. So I was lucky during my faculty search that I actually had multiple options to choose from, which isn't always the case for everyone. I appreciate that. But I also had a fantastic postdoc advisor, David Katz at Emory, who was really serious about not letting me accept an offer out of desperation. Which at the time I was like, Dave, I will take any job. I don't care where it is. I just need a job. And he was like, I believe in you too much. You are too good. You will get other offers. And then also, he had the luxury of being able to keep me for another year as a postdoc if my search didn't pan out, which again is not always available for everyone. But if you can, to try to find people in your corner who can talk you down from that scarcity, desperate mindset to ask, am I only accepting this job because I feel like I have to get a job? Or is this position going to give me what it is that I need to be successful in that position? And I know that isn't always going to be the case for everyone all the time, but also you can still accept it. You're just going in with your eyes wide open. You're not thinking that it's something maybe that it isn't. For me, knowing that I wanted to run a research lab, I really cared about teaching. I needed to go to an institution that valued both of those things and it would support my life as both a teacher and a scholar. And so, there are many schools out there that say they value those things. But again, when you look at the incentives and the amount of time you're given for either, you can tell what it is that they truly value. So he was just really good about holding me back because I felt so desperate. You're in a dark place when you're on the faculty job search. And he was able to help me talk through my options and not just make a choice because I was so desperate. And that really applies at every level, but certainly because it's such a big transition into being a PI and so much is asked of you so early on, it might be the most important in that position. And then in some ways, so I started my lab in 2020. My school was remote, nobody was here on campus. And in some ways, I mean, that obviously sucked. But then in other ways, the silver lining is that I had picked my institution because I thought they were collegial, they were helpful, they were supportive, and they just had like good hearts in the right place. And I got to see that play out immediately, which again wasn't the plan, but it had just sort of reinforced that my instincts during my faculty interviews, I saw how important those were. So when people tell you to look out for red flags, you think, oh, maybe like I'm seeing this thing that's less than ideal, but I'm sure it won't be a big deal. And then you get slammed with something like the pandemic where it really, really becomes important. So those red flags, I think, and your gut instincts at some level really do matter. And it's not a right or a wrong thing, right? Like your gut instinct, you could be wrong, but if that's how your gut feels, it's not going to change once you find yourself in that position. So I think it's listening to yourself, having a mentor or a group of mentors who can like talk you through when your brain feels desperate. And then in your new position, after you've made that transition, is again building that mentoring team for yourself. So I was really lucky. I have a group of postdocs who were all at Emory with me. We've all trickled into faculty positions. We have a group chat where we can again ask each other just really dumb questions, or sometimes I just have to vent. I'm like, oh, my student makes me want to tear my hair out. And I can't vent at the student. It is not their fault. They're just being a normal student. So I just have to like let off the steam, and or sometimes I have to have a hard conversation with a student and I can just like try out a few things with my group chat, and then they can help me realize that I'm being the a-hole at sometimes, and then they can help me walk my tone back. So we do that for each other, and I think that's made us better mentors to have these friends we can rely on. I certainly also tried to build a team where I have people a little bit ahead of me at the university, again, to ask, that I can pop my head in and just run some scenarios by, especially for where I'm a little worried that I did something bad, or I don't necessarily want the chair of my department to know, or I think something's a big deal, and then they'll be able to have the context to tell me that it's not. So I've also built a peer mentoring group here of faculty in other departments, and that's been really helpful. And so at my university, we also have other colleges, and just hearing that the dean of this other college has this approach versus my dean has this approach tells me, oh, maybe it really doesn't matter at the university if the deans are doing different things. So that kind of outside context has been really, really helpful. So I have like friends in the department, friends outside the department, friends who aren't even at this school. And then the last thing about my peer network is I'm also on new PI Slack, which has like hundreds, if not thousands of other new PIs. And then we all get to vent. It's like if I bring a story about this undergrad that's driving me crazy, they tell me other things. I'm like, oh yeah, that's worse. I feel much better now about my life. Um, so I think it's just realizing I think I'm a kinder PI because I have these ways to vent, and then I don't have to do it on my students. And it would be inappropriate for me to complain about certain aspects of my life to the people in my lab. But if you're not careful, if you're a new PI, sometimes the people in your lab are the only people you see. So it's realizing you've made that transition from peer to boss. And like no one in my lab wants to hear me complain about paycheck issues, right? Because I'm making way more money than anyone in my lab. And so it's just like I can't do that, but also every human needs someone that they can complain to. So it's just like in building that for yourself, I think will make you hopefully a kinder PI. And then it just means you also get people, like I said, who can maybe slap you around a little if you need to hear it, and it keeps you on the right track too.
Definitely. I think hearing you kind of talk about mentorship as a PI who has a support group and mentorship from other PIs just kind of reaffirms my belief in how important it is for all stages of
Mhm.
our careers and throughout life. Thank you so much. So now we've kind of concluded our long interview question portion, and we would move into our rapid fire questions where
Yes.
we would each ask you one question and you would answer in a word or a sentence. Yeah. So I will start with the first one. What is one quality every great leader should have?
Mm. Empathy. I think never assuming that when someone does something you don't like, they're doing it out of a malicious intent. Um, it is sometimes malicious, but most of the time it's a misunderstanding. And as the leader, I argue it is your responsibility to get to the bottom of what that is. So if someone's being a dick, like it is your job to figure that out. But most of the time, it's they're doing something and nobody ever told them it's bad to do it that way, or they literally have never had another example of a better way to do it.
So, what is the most exciting development in genomics right now?
This one was a hard one for me to think about. I think the fact that it's now relatively easy to do molecular experiments in non-model organisms means that we can really expand our understanding of what's out there. I'm a C. elegans person. I love the worm. I could have spent this entire hour saying why it's the best for every research question that exists. Acknowledging that that's also not true all the time. It doesn't have a brain. But the fact is that there's so much weird and cool biology out there, and we've just been constrained by how hard it is to make progress. But now that you can get a transcriptome, again, I say relatively easily. I know it's like actually really hard, but compared to where we were before the genomic age, it just means we're now able to realize things that we assumed were the case because of how they are in our model organisms. We're seeing that actually biology is much more creative and interesting than we initially thought. And then I think we find the weird but useful tools. One of the things I always like talking about in my classes are the Nobel Prizes, like the discovery of GFP, the discovery of CRISPR, that came from studying things that no one thought was going to lead to these huge breakthroughs.
Okay, if you could give one piece of advice to younger self, what would it be?
Mm. Okay, I have a flippant answer and then a serious answer. So in college, my mom told me that I should take programming and that I should take statistics. And I was like, those sound terrible and I don't need them and I'm not going to. I'm going to take poetry instead, which I'm really glad I did because I got a lot out of my creative writing classes. But oh my God, I wish I could shake myself and get that kind of background I needed because it's what I needed the most during my PhD, and it, honestly, even now. And she just like rolls her eyes at me all the time. I didn't listen to her. So it's what I tell my own students. I'm like, nobody likes learning programming. It's really hard and it's really annoying. But if you don't do it in a class setting, it's like just too hard to learn on your own. Um, that's my flippant answer. And then what I really wish I could go back and tell myself in college and in grad school is that mentors are cultivated. They don't just happen. And I don't think I fully appreciated again that I had the ownership or the agency to begin seeking out these mentors and how important those connections and that kind of advice can be. So to build myself a team rather than just assume that my PI could do all of that for me or even was willing to do all of that for me.
Cool. Now in your dark times, the tougher times, what is your go-to strategy for staying motivated?
Oh, I think it's definitely always on my friends to lift me up. And so it's like the same committee as the committee of no is what I love doing is celebrating my peers. And especially for women, it's like we're not necessarily encouraged to talk about ourselves or to brag on ourselves. But what I love doing is bragging on my lab and bragging on my friends. And then realizing that when I have the dark times, they can do that for me. And then again, knowing that I might not always be able to do it for myself is having people who are like, no, you are actually like pretty good. Like you did this thing, you got this grant, you got this award, like your students just got this really great acknowledgement. So it's either celebrating the successes of the people in my lab can really help me through the dark times. And then having people who can help me do that for myself too.
Definitely. So, final rapid fire question is what's one bizarre tradition you'd change about the current academic system?
Mm, bizarre. Uh, I don't like the mentality that trainees have to bring refreshments to their committee. I don't know if that's universal, but in my PhD program and my postdoc program, I think the trainees had this mentality of like having to provide coffee or cookies or other things at committee meetings. And it's like such an imbalance of power. I understand. It's like your committee is giving you their brains for hours. You want to provide refreshments since you're a host. But then now that I'm a PI and I know what I pay the people in my lab and I know what I get paid, I'm like, it's just so unfair. I don't know if that's entirely a tradition. I think, okay, my real answer would be it's assuming that leadership is just something you pick up along the way. So then often what you see is someone is responding to a really bad mentorship experience by swinging completely in the other direction. And then their trainees swing back in the other direction because they're responding to that. And so just realizing we don't have to keep reinventing the wheel with every new generation of trainees is that we can teach these skills and they can hopefully have a toolkit that allows them to be very mindful about how they go in to dealing with other people, especially people that they're in charge of.
That is a very good answer. Now, thank you, Dr. Lee, so much for taking the time to speak with us today. We really appreciated the insights you've shared about your background, experiences, and just approaches on being like a truly thoughtful mentor, a PI in charge, and just an agent for change using whatever time that you're able to squeeze out from your already packed schedule. So, and thank you all for being here, and please stay tuned for future installments of the Leadership Dialogue series. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Okay.